pie chart should look familiar. What we tried to do in relative weight, if you will, is summarize the major areas that comprise the last decision, the 5 criteria that inform the Air Force's decision to select the KC-45 as the best value, best capability solution. So this approach allowed the Air Force to assess air refueling capabilities, gave credit for increased capabilities and offloaded range, and it found that the KC-45 offered 22% more fuel capacity, 30% more offloaded range, 68% more cargo capability, and 6% better fuel efficiency when delivering fuel at range. The Air Force assessed the past performance of the contractors and had higher confidence in Northrop Grumman's ability to perform. They also evaluated cost and concluded that Northrop Grumman's proposal was a better value. In an operational scenarios, they concluded that the KC-45 allowed for the mission to be accomplished with 22 fewer aircraft. The bottom line was that KC-45 was found to be better, cheaper, and faster to the warfighter. Then you may recall there was a protest. GAO did a rigorous review of over 100 issues that were raised, and from those 100 issues found that 8 had merit, and essentially came up with a finding for the Defense Department that said, fix these 8 things and get on with it. The GAO didn't rule on the merits of the process, they ruled on particulars, issues within the RFP. And so we expected, based on the GAO finding, that we would simply see those 8 issues corrected and the RFP and the process to move forward essentially based on the warfighting requirements as we understood them from the last time. And after a few months of dialogue and deliberation, it was very clear that a strategic pause would occur and that the department would reconsider the starting point from which to move forward with the competition. And what we got really is, you've seen before, and you'll see it on the next slide, is this. Again, I mentioned when I first opened that what we got was vastly different in terms of requirements and structure and process from what we had during the first competition. So let me dissect this a little bit and fill in some of these boxes. This is the slide that the Defense Department released essentially concurrently with release of the RFP to describe how they were going to buy these tankers and the process by which things would be weighed and valued. So we start in the top box. And in the top box, we have these RFP and contractual requirements. And essentially, those are the 373 mandatory requirements. They're threshold requirements. And the threshold requirements are interesting in that they're all of equal weight. So let me talk about this a little bit. In those 373, some of those requirements are absolutely critical to the warfighter. Survivability, network-centric capability, fuel flow rate to the receivers, fuel maneuvering capability. And some of those things in the 373 are mandatory, and again, mandatory threshold requirements that might be useful but are probably of less value. 151 milliliters per person per hour waste flow in the aircraft laboratory. Hot and cold potable water that supports 473 milliliters per person per hour. Permanent laboratory that must be designed to be serviced through an external port. Sorting and maintaining 2 cold beverages and 2 meals per person per hour. Important, but the question is, are they the same warfighting value as the first category of capability that I mentioned? In this construct, they're all equal. Now, from there, I'll jump down to the bottom box, the non-mandatory requirements, of which there were 93. And in this box, which you only get to, as you know, if the bid prices are within 1% of each other, if they're within 1%, the process is triggered such that these non-mandatory capabilities will be assessed. And those things, as I mentioned before, are many of the things that we believe the warfighter values. They valued them during the last competition, and we believe they still value them in this competition. Increased capability for fuel offload range, ability to meet minimal fuel offload over a range from 7,000-foot runway, minimum ferry range of 9,500 nautical miles, and key cargo handling capabilities. Critical capability that will not be assessed unless the bid prices are within 1% of each other. So I've talked about the top of the chart and the bottom of the chart. Let me focus on the middle of the chart. Assuming that the offeror's proposals are acceptable, and that's how those top 373 are evaluated. It's either pass, fail, acceptable or unacceptable. You get to the green part of this chart, which essentially is the assessment of price. And each offer proposes a price. Those prices will be calculated based on present value. They'll be adjusted based on a few criteria listed below. The integrated air refueling assessment, the FARA adjustment, talks about fuel delivery range in various scenarios. Fuel burn adjustment is interesting. It's just fuel burn based on some set scenarios with a heavy emphasis actually on training, touch and goes, rather than the set of scenarios that reflect more operational type requirements for the aircraft. And MILCON essentially reflects the size and the footprint and the placement of the aircraft. But again, MILCON is a very interesting thing in that if you've had experience with it, MILCON plans go for decades, and essentially the MILCON plans rotate for bases and they move forward regarding capability for a range of aircraft and functions. So our perspective is very simple. The first 373, pass-fail, I guess I'll assume that we're going to pass. I'll make the assumption that our competitor will pass, which means you quickly get past that gate into cost, price. And from that, you essentially have a regimen that's fairly simple. Total proposed price, I called it a cost shootout. A total proposed price. To frame a process kind of perspective here, it's so easy a calculator can do it. That's really the assessment process that this source selection, this draft RFP focuses on. This is a mathematical approach, defining capability for the warfighter, capabilities as defined by this 373 threshold requirements. So what does this really mean when I look at a capabilities perspective? Before we had high value capability and other capability. Now, if you go to the next slide, we have this. Anybody remember this? This is the poster that some folks had in college. So I want to ask you to stare at the center of it. And I don't mean to be facetious, but the reality is, this is the way the requirements are now arrayed. Compare that to the last pie chart, which I'll do in a minute here. Everything's equal. Printer for the aircrew, fuel offload rate, lavatory waste flow, past performance, protection. All these things are equal in value. And so the perspective is, if everything's important, is anything important? How can you value and select valued warfighter capability for the valued warfighter capability if everything is equal in importance? Let me contrast that in the next slide. So before and after. So this is where we were on the left, and this is where we are today. And to me, this is the meat of the warfighter capability question. So on the left, you see we had where we were, the assessment process. We had the 9 KPPs, which essentially translated into 37 mandatory requirements if you look at the sub-elements. Today, there are no KPPs. As an acquisition person, it's not clear to me I've ever encountered an acquisition with no KPPs. We have 373 mandatory threshold requirements, but again, everything weighted equally. From a capabilities and performance perspective, not quite sure what that gets you. If you never pass that 1% gate and get to the valued warfighting capability that the warfighter really needs. Risk. Why is risk important? Last time, risk was considered as part of the evaluation process, and this time, risk is essentially pass-fail. No risk assessment for cost, schedule, or the ability to satisfy performance. So what does that really mean?